Most Americans have come to agree that the Vietnam War is still one of the greatest blunders in American history. It showed that American foreign policy wasn't so polished up and changes were necessary. There were many political actions that were taken to try to convince the U.S. people that the war was winnable. But, as is shown in history books and in Boom, Voices of the 60s by Tom Brokaw, even the sharpest of American politicians were wrong. In his novel, Brokaw quotes Nellie Coakley, an Army nurse who was stationed in Vietnam. She states, "I wanted to believe that we were there for an honorable purpose, but the other part that was tugging at me was, why in the world don't we try to do more to solve these issues without tearing bodies apart like this?" This showed that even the men and women who were giving their lives might have been dying for a cause they didn't believe in. Despite what happened in Vietnam and what should have been learned, present-day leaders mobilized the U.S. military to fight in the Middle East in what has been suggested to be just like the war in the 60s and 70s. The forces that are stationed there are ill-prepared and ill-equipped to fight the war that they are being called upon to fight, a war for another country's independence. Once again, America is fighting against more than just an enemy. We are fighting against an ideology that cannot be toppled as long as there are those that use religion, hatred, violence, and lies to recruit more people to take up the jihad against the West. Two wars are similar in many regards, in that the U.S. was then, and is now, attempting to take a stand against those governments and ideals that threaten the safety of America and the safety of the world. Yet there have been many individuals who have made certain that America does not blindly follow those that approve the war, such as America's leading politicians, as was the case for much of the time we spent in Vietnam. Many individuals in both politics and the media promote differing viewpoints that identify the mistakes that have been made and identify what the unreal projections for the war are. This leads to more Americans being educated and having a better understanding of our situation overseas. In an interview with Michael Barney, I learned of many things that happened during Vietnam, which I have noticed occurring in similar ways in the present wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He served aboard the USS Corralsea from 1968 to 1970, and even there he noticed a number of Marines that traded with the Vietnam locals for drugs such as heroin and speed. He stated, "The number of men who relied on drugs to keep them sane through the war was astounding. It was not the way that a war should have been fought, and it certainly wasn't being fought in the manner that the government was telling the American people." This description of drug habits and practices in 1968 is reminiscent of the drug practices of the U.S. Army in Iraq and Afghanistan today. The war in the Middle East is one of the first times soldiers have been given prescription antidepressants to help them cope with the lengthy and repeated tours. Not only are they serving up to 3 terms, but the troops say they aren't getting enough downtime in between to rest. It's not easy for soldiers to admit the problems that they're having over there for a variety of reasons. If they do admit it, then the only solution given is pills, says Sergeant Christopher Lejeune. Not even in the horrible conditions of Vietnam was this drug problem so severe. Drafted soldiers would spend a year on the front line, but there is a rare chance that they would go back. Yet in the Middle East, troops that are enlisted are sent for over 3 tours of duty, and nearly 30% of troops on their 3rd deployment suffer from serious mental health problems. This illustrates that the arguments that the military is sufficient for the task ahead of it in the war are ignorant to the fact that troops themselves cannot cope with a war in which they are asked to breach houses, to find insurgents, and see little bitty tiny shoes and toys on the floor. The war in the Middle East, just like Vietnam, is a war that the U.S. should not have become involved with if they weren't completely prepared to handle such a long occupation. Upon further discussion with Mr. Barney, he told me that the most difficult thing about being deployed was simply not knowing what was going on. Some soldiers also discuss the stupidity of this strategy in Vietnam. They state they would be at a village 1 week and then be at the same place 3 weeks later, retaking the same village. It was this unclear, ineffective warfare that led to the demoralization of the troops. Mr. Barney also acknowledged the discrepancies between what he would hear in the news and what he would witness every day. He stated, "According to news reports we received, all was going pretty well with the war, but there was never anything specific that we learned of. What the press was told by the government just was not matching up with what others saw each day." The general feeling was that the soldiers that were defending the United States had essentially been abandoned by their government, and that there was nothing they could do to improve their situation. They simply had to continue to do their duty and hope that they would survive. To those that have served in wars, they know that what our military is doing for us is invaluable, and they deserve all of our thanks and respect. Despite the fact that we are in a similar situation from 40 years ago, there's no need to not show unity and support for our armed forces. They have earned it by all regards. Instead of dragging America into another war where no outcome will be considered victorious, we should have learned from our mistakes and explored other paths of diplomacy instead of committing troops to a foreign conflict with little international support. And as for those who put us in a similar situation, as James Webb said, we owe them our loyalty, but they owe us sound judgment.